The first sign of them was a distortion in the upper atmosphere, subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. But humanity had been looking. Ever since their telescopes first picked up the immense, approaching fleet, the world had held its collective breath. Then, one by one, they arrived. The Highborn did not descend in the manner of cautious diplomats or wary explorers. They arrived as rulers, as beings for whom conquest was a foregone conclusion. Their fleet, a vast collection of sleek, dark vessels that shimmered with a strange, almost liquid metal sheen, moved into orbit with mathematical precision. Every human satellite, every broadcasting station on Earth was overridden with a single signal, a declaration of contact. The United Nations headquarters in Geneva became the center of the world overnight. The General Assembly had never seen such urgency, such fear. Military leaders sat alongside world presidents, prime ministers, and monarchs, each of them understanding the stakes. Humanity was about to meet its first true galactic power, and by every prediction, it was unlikely to end well. The Highborn did not delay. Within hours, a single vessel detached from the Armada and descended into the Swiss Alps, settling above the shores of Lake Geneva. It did not land, nor did it need to. Anti-gravity kept it perfectly suspended. From its underbelly, a beam of silvery light extended downward, and from within it emerged their emissary, Lord Atraxas. He was tall, taller than any human by at least a head, his frame wrapped in elaborate, near-iridescent robes that gave the impression of woven starlight. His features were striking, angular, symmetrical, with eyes of molten gold that radiated the weight of generations. The Highborn were, without question, beautiful in a way that transcended the human sense of aesthetics. They had designed themselves that way over millennia of genetic refinement. Atraxas strode forward, accompanied by two guards clad in ceremonial armor, their presence a silent statement of power. They stopped before the delegation of world leaders, who had gathered with careful posturing and composed expressions. It was the President of the United Nations Security Council who spoke first, her voice firm despite the tension in the air. I am President Elena Yao of the United Nations. We welcome you to Earth. Lord Atraxas inclined his head slightly, though there was no true deference in the gesture. It was a courtesy, nothing more. When he spoke, his voice was smooth, his accent alien, yet perfectly articulate in English, as if he had always known the language. You are the representatives of your species? A pause. We are. Atraxas's golden eyes swept over the assembly, and when he next spoke, his words were not a greeting. You misunderstand the nature of our meeting. The room seemed to shrink under the weight of his tone. The Highborn ascendancy has ruled this galaxy for over 10,000 of your years. We have encountered many civilizations. Some, like your own, are young, ambitious, chaotic, teetering on the precipice of destruction by your own hands. Others have been wiser, understanding the natural order of things. He gestured upward, as if encompassing the entire fleet above them. Your species has reached a crossroads. The path ahead is simple. Submit to the ascendancy as a client species, bound by our laws and protected under our dominion, or resist and be removed as a threat to the galactic order. Silence followed his words. It was the silence of a world holding its breath, of a species collectively realizing the weight of their predicament. President Yao did not flinch. You assume that our only options are submission or destruction. Atraxas met her gaze, and for a brief moment, something flickered across his expression, mild amusement. All species assume they have a third option, he said smoothly. It is an unfortunate pattern of the unenlightened. Yao's fingers tightened at her sides, but her voice remained steady. Humanity is not a war-hungry race. We have our conflicts, yes, but we are capable of diplomacy, of cooperation. You are capable of many things, Atraxas acknowledged, but restraint is not one of them. Your history is one of war, conquest, division. You fight amongst yourselves for reasons as trivial as borders, resources, ideology. How, then, Do you expect us to believe that you will be anything but a liability in the greater order of this galaxy? The leaders exchanged glances. They had prepared for this, prepared for the accusations, the scrutiny. But it was another thing entirely to hear it spoken aloud by a species that had already judged them unworthy. It was the Secretary General of the UN who spoke next, his voice calm. And if we refuse both options? Atraxis's golden eyes locked onto him. You will not. The finality in his tone was absolute. The air seemed to thicken, the tension near palpable. No one moved. Then, slowly, Atraxis stepped forward, lowering his voice to something quieter, something more dangerous. But I will allow you the illusion of choice for now. Consider our offer. We will return in one of your lunar cycles. If your answer is not one of submission. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. With a single turn, Atraxis and his guards stepped back into the beam of light. Within moments, they ascended, disappearing into the waiting vessel above. The ship did not linger. It lifted effortlessly into the sky, vanishing into the vastness of space. For a long moment, the humans stood in place, unmoving, as if expecting another declaration, another threat. None came. Finally, President Yao exhaled. Well, she murmured, that went exactly as expected. But even as she said the words, there was something in her expression, a glint of something unspoken. She turned to her advisors, to the leaders of the world. In a voice barely above a whisper, she uttered the thought that had already begun forming in her mind. They expect us to fight. A pause. Let's give them something they won't expect. The world should have been in a panic. History dictated that when a superior force loomed over a weaker one, war was inevitable. But as the highborn fleet lingered in orbit, waiting for humanity to come to the right decision, something unexpected happened. Instead of mobilizing weapons, the leaders of Earth mobilized something else entirely. It started as a quiet directive from the highest levels of government, passed through back channels, research institutions, and media conglomerates. The goal was simple. If the Highborn believed humanity was nothing but a warlike, primitive species, then it was time to show them otherwise. Not with missiles or warships, but with something they would never see coming. Culture. The first wave was subtle. Scientists and linguists from around the world worked together to flood the Highborn's translation networks with human literature, philosophy, and history. The works of Shakespeare, Confucius, Rumi, and Marcus Aurelius were transmitted into the ether, encoded within signals that would be difficult to block without drawing attention. Music, classical, jazz, rock, electronic, drifted into the data streams of the ascendancy, slipping past their filters like whispers through cracks in a fortress wall. At first, the Highborn ignored it. To them, it was nothing more than the desperate noise of an inferior race trying to be heard. But then, something unexpected occurred. Among the younger species under the Highborn's dominion, lesser races who had lived for centuries under their rule, human art found a foothold. The rigid, orderly society of the ascendancy had long stifled individuality, reducing creative expression to little more than ceremonial tradition. Yet here was something new, something raw, something that spoke of love, loss, rebellion, and hope. And the lesser species listened. The second phase of humanity's campaign struck even deeper. It began with trade. Not weapons, not technology, but commodities that were uniquely human. Earth's artisans crafted intricate designs, blending old-world craftsmanship with modern ingenuity, creating goods unlike anything in the Ascendancy's existing markets. Perfumes with scents never before smelled by alien noses. Textiles that shimmered and adapted to the wearer's emotions. Holographic projections that could create immersive experiences of Earth's vast landscapes, its myths and legends. More than that, human traders did something unheard of in Ascendancy economics. They haggled. Where the Highborn and their client species had long operated under fixed, rigid trade hierarchies, humanity introduced an entirely new element: negotiation, bargaining. Deals sealed over shared meals and laughter rather than dry, contractual agreements. For the first time in centuries, The carefully structured economic systems of the ascendancy were disrupted, and the lesser species embraced it. Human traders found themselves welcomed in markets where highborn influence had long stagnated. Their humor, their adaptability, their willingness to bend rules instead of breaking them made them indispensable. They weren't conquerors. They were something far more dangerous. They were popular. Lord Atraxas was not amused. Standing aboard his command ship, he listened in silence as his intelligence officers presented their findings. He had expected humanity to resist in some fashion, perhaps through guerrilla tactics or desperate diplomatic pleas. What he had not anticipated was this insidious spread. Humanity had not fought back. They had woven themselves into the very fabric of the empire. "This is nothing more than a distraction," one of his subordinates said dismissively. "A last feeble attempt at influence. It will pass." Atraxas was not so sure. He had already received reports that some of the Empire's younger species had begun adopting human customs. Some had even started requesting human advisors in trade negotiations. Worse, some highborn nobles, his own kind, had taken a liking to certain human art forms. He had seen them watching performances, reading poetry, even attempting to understand human humor. This was not a temporary distraction. It was contagion. The thought unsettled him. The Ascendancy had maintained control for millennia, not just through military power, but through the belief that their culture was superior, that their way was the only way. If humanity was proving otherwise, if they were making others question, then the danger they posed was far greater than any war fleet. Still, Atraxas was not yet ready to believe they were a true threat. "They are insects," he said finally, his voice calm. "Let them play their games. The Empire does not change so easily." And yet, as he turned back to the great expanse of space, he could not shake the feeling that something had already changed. The first major crack in highborn control came in a place no one expected. The planet Veladros 4, a minor world on the edges of the Ascendancy, had long been a quiet, obedient client state. Its people were efficient, disciplined, and utterly predictable. But in the weeks following humanity's cultural influx, something strange happened. The planetary governor, a rigid highborn bureaucrat, had issued a decree forbidding the consumption of human media. He had expected obedience. Instead, the people protested, openly, loudly. For the first time in centuries, the highborn authorities had to enforce compliance. They seized contraband human literature, arrested merchants trading earth goods, and publicly denounced human influence. But the more they resisted, the more the people wanted it. By the time news of the uprising reached the core worlds, it was too late. Veladros 4 had not declared independence. It had not taken up arms. It had simply stopped listening. And in the heart of the Ascendancy, a simple, terrifying truth began to take shape. Humanity did not need to conquer. It was being invited in. Back on Earth, President Yao watched the data feeds with quiet satisfaction. The world's greatest minds had come together, not to build weapons, but to craft something far more effective. They had set fire to an idea. And once an idea took root, no army in the universe could stop it. She turned to her advisors, her voice calm but resolute. "They expect us to fight," she murmured, echoing the words from weeks before. She allowed herself the faintest of smiles. "Let's keep giving them something they won't expect." Lord Atraxas sat in his private chambers aboard the Ascendancy flagship, staring at a holoscreen filled with reports. The situation was unraveling faster than he had anticipated. The humans had not fought. They had not rebelled. Instead, they had infected the Empire. Reports from across the Ascendancy painted an unsettling picture. Highborn governors on lesser worlds were struggling to maintain their grip. Trade networks once dominated by Ascendancy merchants were now flooded with human goods. Worse still, human ideas were spreading. Poetry, music, philosophy, even humor. The humans had embedded themselves in the fabric of the Ascendancy, and now the Empire itself was changing. Atraxas closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling slowly. This was not how it was supposed to be. "Status update," he commanded. His second in command, a younger noble named Valith, stepped forward, her face carefully neutral. Human influence continues to expand, she reported. We have attempted countermeasures, propaganda, economic sanctions, cultural restrictions, but they have been ineffective. Atraxis's golden eyes flicked toward her. Explain. Valith hesitated. The lesser species within our dominion resist the restrictions. Many view human culture as a form of liberation. Atraxis scoffed. Liberation? From what? Valith did not answer immediately, and that silence told him everything. The Highborn had ruled for so long that they had stopped asking if their rule was wanted. It had simply been assumed, and now humanity was showing the Empire that another way was possible. On Valadros 4, the governor's ban on human media had the opposite effect of what was intended. Instead of suppressing human influence, it amplified it. Human art became contraband. Human music was played in secret, like whispered rebellion. Philosophy discussions happened in underground gatherings. And it wasn't just Valadros 4. From the glittering spires of the Highborn core worlds to the industrial colonies of the Outer Rim, human culture was becoming an unstoppable force. It started in small ways. Merchants humming earth melodies, scholars secretly studying human texts. But it grew quickly. Entire planetary economies were now dependent on human trade networks. More and more client species preferred working with humans over their highborn rulers. And worst of all, even some highborn nobles had begun participating in human culture. At first, it was curiosity, a passing amusement. But then, highborn intellectuals began studying human philosophy, questioning their own rigid doctrines. Young nobles held human-style salons, debating ethics, politics, and free will. A highborn aristocrat was caught laughing, truly laughing, at a human comedy broadcast. A scandal. Atraxis had dismissed the early signs of human influence as irrelevant. Now he saw the truth. This was not an accident. It was deliberate. At the heart of it all were the human diplomats. They weren't warriors. They weren't conquerors. They were charmers, and the Ascendancy had never encountered anything like them. Where highborn diplomacy was rigid and formal, human diplomats were disarmingly informal. They joked. They told stories. They listened. They made themselves indispensable. Ambassador Rachel Vasquez had become a legend within the diplomatic circles of the Empire. She had a talent for getting even the most rigid highborn officials to relax, something unheard of. At a formal banquet on the capital world of Horus Prime, Vasquez sat across from a delegation of highborn lords. It was a room filled with power, beings who had never been questioned, never been challenged in meaningful ways. And yet, by the end of the night, they were laughing. Actual, genuine laughter. Not the cold, polite chuckles of political theater, but real, unrestrained amusement. Over what? A human joke. One of the lords had asked Vasquez why humanity was so chaotic, why they had no single ruling bloodline, no unbreakable hierarchy. Vasquez had smirked. Because we figured out that the only thing worse than an empire run by politicians is an empire run by inbred aristocrats. Silence. Then laughter. The highborn nobles knew the truth of their own system. They had just never heard it spoken so boldly. And that was the moment Vasquez knew. Humanity had already won. Not everyone saw humanity's rise as a good thing. The highborn military caste, the enforcers of ascendancy rule, were growing restless. To them, humanity was a disease that needed to be purged. If human influence continued to spread, the highborn would lose control of the empire they had built over millennia. General Zyrith, leader of the Imperial fleet, made his stance clear. Humanity must be eliminated before it is too late. Atraxis disagreed. He saw the danger, but he also saw the opportunity. For all their arrogance, the highborn had never been loved. They were feared, respected, obeyed. But humans? Humans inspired loyalty. That made them dangerous, yes, but it also made them useful. So Atraxis made a decision. He would not allow the Empire to destroy humanity. Instead, he would do something far more risky. He would listen. 2 weeks later, Lord Atraxis invited Ambassador Vasquez to a private audience. It was unprecedented. A highborn lord, one of the ruling elite, asking to speak with a human. When Vasquez arrived, she was calm, smiling, as if she had already won. Atraxas studied her for a long moment before speaking. "You know what you're doing, don't you?" She tilted her head. "Which part?" "The infection." His voice was laced with something unfamiliar. Amusement? Frustration? Vasquez leaned forward. "Lord Atraxas, your people think the only way to rule is through control. But humans? We don't conquer. We connect. That's why your empire is changing. Not because we forced it to, but because your people want it to." Atraxas exhaled slowly. He had spent his life believing in the unshakable dominance of the highborn. But now he saw the truth. The empire had never been strong. It had only been unchallenged. And now it belonged to humanity. Not by force, not by war, but by making the empire want them there. For the first time in centuries, Lord Atraxas did something no highborn had done before. He smiled. The turning point came when it was least expected. Lord Atraxas had watched the situation unfold for months, carefully analyzing every aspect of humanity's influence. He had thought that if he remained patient, the human cultural wave would eventually subside. But the wave kept growing, relentless and unstoppable. It swept across the ascendancy like wildfire, touching worlds far from Earth, reaching places where even highborn authority had once felt untouchable. The lesser species, those who had once feared or respected the highborn, were now drawn to the human way of life. Human art and music had become prized across the empire. Trade routes, once dominated by the ascendancy's iron grip, were now teeming with human goods. Philosophers from all over the galaxy were quoting Earth thinkers, while highborn scholars found themselves poring over the works of humanity's great minds, especially those who challenged hierarchical structures and authoritarian rule. And then, the cracks in the ascendancy's power began to show. The first sign that the highborn leadership was beginning to lose its control came on the industrial world of Tenebris, one of the Empire's most strategic planets. It was a world that had been fiercely loyal to the ascendancy, a place where the highborn military kept a strong presence to ensure compliance. The planet's factories churned out the weapons and technology that fed the Empire's expansion, but they were no longer running smoothly. It started with a small group of workers, a mix of lesser species and discontented highborn nobles, quietly exchanging human literature and media. They held secret meetings discussing the concepts of freedom, creativity, and individual rights that humanity had introduced into the ascendancy's worldview. These discussions, seemingly innocuous at first, soon grew into something larger. Tenebris became the first planet to openly resist the ascendancy's harsh economic policies, not with open violence, but through passive noncompliance. Workers slow-walked their tasks, refused to adhere to deadlines, and even sabotaged the Empire's carefully controlled supply chains, all in the name of the ideals humanity had introduced. The resistance spread like a virus, infecting not just the workforce but entire factions of the highborn elite. General Zyrith, still determined to eradicate humanity's influence, was furious. He immediately dispatched a fleet to Tenebris, prepared to quash the rebellion with military force. It was the response Atraxas had feared. But when the fleet arrived, something unexpected happened. Instead of encountering an organized military rebellion, Zyrith found himself facing a disorganized, widespread cultural uprising, one that was being fueled not by violence, but by the simple ideas humanity had introduced. People had stopped listening to the highborn, not because they had been coerced, but because they had found something they truly wanted. They wanted to be part of a world that was more than just the cold efficiency the ascendancy had promised. They wanted freedom, they wanted change, and they wanted humanity. Zyrith's fleet arrived at Tenebris in full battle readiness, expecting to bring the planet to its knees within hours. But the resistance, though large, was disorganized. There was no armed rebellion, no front lines to storm. Instead, the workers and citizens simply refused to cooperate. They continued with their lives, slowing the factories, delaying shipments, installing every process the Highborn had taken for granted. It was not the kind of resistance that could be crushed with military force. Xyrath's strategy faltered, and in his frustration, he made a critical error. He attempted to force a cultural edict upon Tenebris, issuing an imperial command to banish all human influence, art, music, literature, trade, within the planet's borders. The reaction was immediate and furious. The Highborn fleet, though capable of overwhelming any armed resistance, was not prepared for the psychological war that followed. Xyrath's orders were ignored. Members of his own crew began privately resisting. Human literature continued to be distributed, and within days, the planet had descended into a cultural siege where every effort to suppress human influence only seemed to make it more popular. The entire fleet was at a standstill, unable to proceed with the force they had planned. Atraxis had been right. The Highborn were losing the battle, not to weapons, not to strategy, but to something far more insidious, to ideas. Back at the Ascendancy's capital, the Highborn leadership was divided. Lord Atraxis, who had quietly watched this unfolding situation, was the first to speak out publicly against Xyrath's military response. "The problem is not with the planet's rebellion," Atraxis said in the council meeting, his voice calm but unwavering. "The problem is that we never understood what humanity's influence would do to us. We assumed it would be temporary, a mere curiosity, but it has become a fundamental shift in the way the Empire operates. The people no longer care for our control. They care for what humanity represents." The Highborn leaders listened in stunned silence. Atraxis continued, "We have ruled through fear for millennia, but fear only sustains power for so long. If we continue to suppress humanity's influence, we risk losing control of our own empire." Xyrath, who had always championed the strength of the Highborn military, bristled at Atraxis's words. "And you propose we do nothing? Allow them to spread their infection unchecked?" Atraxis's gaze never wavered. "Not nothing. We adapt." The room fell silent. Atraxis's proposition was simple. Instead of forcing humanity's cultural influence out, they should embrace it. The Highborn, he argued, were the ones who had long dismissed the power of ideas, of culture, of shared values. Now, humanity had shown them something far more powerful than any weapon. The Empire, as it stood, could not survive by continuing to dominate. It needed a change. It needed to learn to connect. And the only way to do that was to integrate humanity into the structure of the Ascendancy by inviting them in. Over the following months, the Ascendant idea began to spread through the core leadership of the Ascendancy. Some resisted, of course. The old guard, those who had never known a world where the Highborn were not supreme, still clung to their ways. But even they could not deny the growing influence of humanity's ideas. By the time Lord Atraxis took his proposal to the Imperial Council for a final vote, there was an undercurrent of support. The Highborn had never been known for their willingness to change, but it was becoming increasingly clear that the old ways could no longer hold the Empire together. The Highborn had always ruled by keeping the galaxy divided, but humanity had introduced something altogether different: the idea that the galaxy could be united. The council voted in favor of Atraxis's proposal, and with that, humanity had won, not through force, not through war, but through integration. They had shown the Ascendancy that the future of the galaxy was not in conquering or controlling, but in connecting. By the time humanity's cultural influence had permeated the farthest reaches of the Ascendancy, it was clear that the old ways of control were no longer viable. Lord Atraxis's proposal had passed, and with it, the beginnings of an unprecedented shift in the balance of power within the Empire. The Highborn, those who had once thought themselves above all others, were now recognizing something they had long dismissed. Humanity wasn't a threat to be eradicated. They were an asset. The transition was subtle at first. Highborn intellectuals and lesser species alike began to openly study human practices, trade, economics, governance, and most notably, human diplomacy. It wasn't just that the human approach was pragmatic or even efficient. It was charismatic. Human diplomats didn't rely on fear or force. They won people over by relating, by sharing ideas that resonated with the people of the galaxy. Humanity, the ascendancy now realized, had turned their most entrenched weaknesses into their greatest strengths. Where the Highborn had built an empire with the cold precision of a machine, humans had built connections. Connections that could not be easily undone. On the trade routes, humanity became a cornerstone of the ascendancy's economic machine. Human traders were no longer just business people. They were cultural ambassadors. They brought not only products, but new ways of doing business that the Highborn had never considered. Highborn merchants, initially dismissive of human methods, were forced to adapt. Gone were the rigid contracts that had governed trade for millennia. In their place came a system of negotiation, human-style negotiation, full of humor, compromise, and even risk. It wasn't the Highborn way, but it was a better way. The more the Ascendancy's systems became interwoven with human business practices, the more evident it became that humanity had become indispensable to the Empire's economy. Within a few generations, the Highborn had built entire economic sectors around human-run trade. Planetary markets that had once been cold and strictly regulated now thrived on the chaos and creativity humanity had introduced. What had once been seen as a flaw, the human tendency to innovate, to take risks, was now revered as the driving force behind the Ascendancy's growing prosperity. And it wasn't just trade that humanity was reshaping. Human scientists, who had once been considered primitive compared to their Highborn counterparts, were now leading the way in technological innovation. The Highborn had never fully grasped the power of human collaboration. Highborn scientists worked alone, each an isolated genius in their field. But humanity understood the power of teams, of gathering multiple minds to solve complex problems. The Highborn quickly realized that humans, with their diverse and collaborative approaches, were able to achieve breakthroughs that Highborn researchers could not. Human scientific teams had made major advancements in fields like medicine, energy, and even interstellar travel. They had introduced new methods of resource management, better ways of preserving ecosystems, and new ways of thinking. In many ways, humanity had turned the Ascendancy's greatest advantage, their vast resources, into a disadvantage. Humans didn't just take from the galaxy, they made it better. But it wasn't just business and science that humanity was changing, it was the very culture of the Ascendancy. Human writers, artists, and musicians had already infiltrated every corner of the Empire, but their influence had expanded far beyond entertainment. What started as simple art exhibitions became something more. Human creative philosophies began to take root. For the first time in millennia, the Highborn began to question the very core of their rule. Their belief in superiority, in the inherent right to dominate, was being subtly undermined by the very values humanity held dear: equality, freedom, and creativity. In the courts of Highborn nobles, human philosophers were now regular guests. Human humor had broken down the rigidity of Highborn formality, allowing even the most stoic and powerful to relax, to laugh, and to connect. For the first time, the Highborn recognized what they had been missing all these centuries: compassion. And the more the Highborn embraced humanity's influence, the more they began to understand it. Their imperial arrogance, once their greatest strength, now seemed like a weakness. They had long ruled through power and fear, but the humans had shown them that true leadership came not from strength, but from influence, from the ability to bring people together, to foster cooperation instead of fear. Humanity had not simply changed the Ascendancy. They had transformed it. As more Highborn worlds adopted human methods, the resistance from the old guard began to crumble. General Zyrith, once one of the Empire's most feared military leaders, had grown increasingly disillusioned with the direction the Empire was taking. He had watched as his own soldiers, once loyal to the Highborn cause, began adopting human customs. The rebellion that had begun on Tenebris spread like wildfire through the ranks of the military. The Highborn military caste, once the unquestioned backbone of the Ascendancy, found itself obsolete. They could no longer command the loyalty of the Empire's people because humanity had shown them a different way, a better way. A way that didn't involve domination, but cooperation. A way that didn't require weapons, but understanding. The final blow came when General Zyrith, in an unprecedented act of defiance, publicly declared his allegiance to humanity. He was not alone. Many of his fellow officers joined him. The military, which had once been the Ascendancy's iron fist, now saw humanity not as an enemy, but as partners. The highborn generals, realizing that their time had passed, quietly retreated into obscurity. The day the Highborn Council voted to officially include humanity in the ruling hierarchy of the Ascendancy was not marked by fanfare or victory parades. It was a quiet, solemn affair. There was no need for celebration. Humanity was not conquering the Ascendancy. They were not overthrowing the Highborn. They were being invited in. The final vote passed with an overwhelming majority. Humanity was not granted a seat at the table by force or coercion. They had earned it by proving that they had something the Highborn could never have, the ability to connect, to build bridges where others would have built walls. As President Yao, the first human representative to sit on the Imperial Council, stood before the assembled leaders of the galaxy, she spoke not of victory, but of unity. "We didn't win by defeating you," she said. "We won by showing you that together, we can build something better. Together, we can connect the galaxy in ways we never thought possible." The Empire, once fragmented and divided by centuries of hierarchy and control, was now united. Not through force, but through a shared vision, one that humanity had offered and the Highborn had accepted. The Ascendancy had changed. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, then with a swiftness that took even the Highborn themselves by surprise. What had once been an empire built on rigid hierarchy, cold precision, and unchecked dominance had transformed into something new, a more fluid and connected system, united not through fear, but through a shared understanding. The Highborn, once proud of their impenetrable superiority, had begun to appreciate the unspoken truth that they needed humanity just as much as humanity needed them. But this change did not come without consequences. For centuries, the Highborn had governed with a singular vision. They were rulers, conquerors by nature. But now, they found themselves forced to confront something far more unsettling, the loss of their old way of life. The Old Guard, the militaristic, authoritarian faction of the Ascendancy, had always believed in the inevitability of their control. They had seen themselves as gods, and for many, that belief had been absolute. Yet, humanity's influence had sparked a quiet revolution, not of weapons, not of violent conflict, but of ideas, of culture, of innovation. As the days passed, the new reality began to set in. The empire that had once feared humanity was now slowly coming to see that humanity's greatest strength was their ability to adapt, to forge connections, and to build the very things that the Highborn had failed to grasp: trust, loyalty, and cooperation. In the heart of the Ascendancy, the Highborn Imperial Council had convened to discuss the future of their empire. But this meeting was unlike any other. The room, once filled with stony-faced Highborn lords and military commanders, now felt strangely empty. There were fewer of them. The military faction that had been so instrumental in preserving the old order had quietly retreated, their power now waning. The Highborn leaders now turned their eyes toward a future where change was no longer a threat but a necessity. Lord Atraxis, once a staunch defender of Highborn superiority, was now one of the strongest advocates for the new direction. He had once thought the rise of humanity would be an eventual conflict, but as time passed, he began to see something far more significant. Humanity, by merely existing, had forced the Highborn to re-evaluate their entire structure. They had been wrong in assuming that they had the right to rule all others by sheer power. They had assumed that their way of life was eternal, an unquestionable legacy of superiority. Now, Atraxis realized that the future of the Ascendancy depended not on domination, but on mutual growth. He had seen it in the streets of Highborn cities, in the way their people had begun to embrace human art human ideas, and human ways of thinking. It was no longer about conquest. It was about understanding. "I propose a new order," Atraxas said to the council, his voice steady but resolute. "One where all species, highborn and human, are equal partners in the ascendancy. We must allow for cooperation, not subjugation." There was silence. The old guard looked uncomfortable, some muttering among themselves. But Atraxas's words resonated with a growing faction. Those who had seen the benefits of humanity's presence, who had felt the changes in their own hearts, in their own way of thinking. Atraxas turned toward President Yao, who had been invited to the council as a representative of humanity. He had watched her over the past few years, noting how her presence had transformed the atmosphere of every meeting, every gathering. She wasn't just a representative. She was a bridge between worlds, between peoples. The first human to sit at the council table was no longer an anomaly, a foreign entity. She had become a symbol of the new era. "We must not allow our old ways to determine our future," Atraxas continued. "Humanity has shown us the path forward, one of collaboration, shared progress, and mutual respect. Let's not squander this opportunity to grow." The silence was broken by a voice. One of the younger highborn members, who had recently embraced the ideals humanity had brought to the ascendancy. "I agree," she said. "For too long, we have looked upon others as inferior, as tools to be used. But now I see that we have much to learn from them." A murmur spread through the room. The old guard, those who had once clung desperately to their supremacy, were now outnumbered by those who saw the wisdom in Atraxas's words. It was a moment of profound change, a shift in the very foundations of the ascendancy. And in that moment, President Yao knew the empire had already begun to rebuild. Not through domination, not through force, but through understanding, through connection. The formal change did not come in a sweeping declaration, nor in the roar of battle. It came quietly, gradually, as the highborn invited humanity to be a true partner in the ascendancy. The first step was symbolic. Humanity would no longer be excluded from the inner councils. Instead, they would have a seat at the table, an equal voice in the discussions of the galaxy's future. To celebrate this new era, a joint celebration was held on the capital world of Horus Prime. It was a spectacle like none before, an intergalactic celebration of unity, of shared progress. Highborn and human alike came together to celebrate what they had achieved. Music, art, food, and ideas from both sides filled the air. The ascendancy's greatest philosophers engaged in debates with human thinkers, exploring the concepts of freedom, creativity, and cooperation. The best human musicians performed alongside the greatest highborn composers, blending their styles into something unique, something new. President Yao was seated beside Lord Atraxas, her eyes scanning the crowd. She watched as both highborn and humans gathered in harmony, not out of obligation, but out of a shared desire to build something better, something bigger than themselves. This was not just a victory for humanity. It was a victory for the galaxy. It was the first step in a new era, one where connection and collaboration were no longer seen as weaknesses, but strengths. As the celebration continued late into the evening, Atraxas stood beside Yao, his eyes fixed on the crowd. He had once believed that the ascendancy was a perfect empire, unassailable, eternal. But now, looking at the unity between the species, he understood that perfection was an illusion. The true strength of an empire came not from its ability to conquer, but from its ability to connect. He turned to Yao. "We've done it," Atraxas said softly. "We've created something that will last." Yao smiled, her eyes reflecting the stars above. "Yes," she said, "but we haven't created it alone. We've built it together." And as the stars shone down on Horus Prime, humanity and the highborn stood side by side, their future no longer defined by conflict, but by the bonds they had formed. The empire had been won, not through weapons, not through bloodshed, but through unity. In that moment, Atraxas understood what humanity had already known. The true power of an empire is not in its ability to conquer, but in its ability to connect. Years had passed since humanity's cultural influence had shifted the balance of power within the Ascendancy. The initial shock of that change had long since faded into something more tangible, a lasting transformation of how the galaxy would operate in the future. The Highborn, who had once ruled through fear, now led with a deeper sense of responsibility, recognizing that they no longer held the reins of power alone. Humanity, with its unpredictable ways, had shown them something they could not ignore, a new path. As President Yao stood at the window of her private quarters, gazing out at the sprawling capital city of Horus Prime, she couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. What had once been a fragile hope, the idea that humanity could not only survive the first contact but thrive, had become an undeniable reality. The human presence in the Ascendancy was no longer just tolerated, it was embraced. And this embrace was reshaping not only the political landscape of the galaxy, but its very culture, economy, and philosophy. The world was changing, and humanity had become an integral part of that evolution. The galaxy was no longer a series of fragmented empires, separated by ancient borders and military superiority. It had become something else, something greater. It was a galactic community, not unified by a single ruler or by force, but by the shared ideals of connection, cooperation, and mutual respect. The Imperial Council, once a bastion of highborn superiority, now looked very different. The majority of the seats were still filled by the highborn, of course, but the presence of humans was undeniable. In addition to President Yao, who had been the first human to hold a seat at the table, other human diplomats, thinkers, and leaders had gradually risen to positions of influence. Their presence was not merely symbolic anymore. It was essential. The meetings of the Imperial Council were no longer long-winded debates over who could exercise control over the galaxy's resources, nor were they about maintaining an iron grip over the lesser species. They had become discussions about how to move forward, how to build a future based on shared prosperity, peace, and the common good of all species. President Yao had long since abandoned her initial hesitance about her place in the council. The day she had first stepped into the room, she had felt the weight of every species gaze upon her. It had been overwhelming, knowing that she was a representative of humanity and the first to stand at the table as a peer to the Highborn. Now, years later, she had become a steadying influence on the council, a voice that championed diplomacy, open dialogue, and compromise. Every decision made in the council now required careful consideration, not just of the Highborn's desires, but of the needs and aspirations of all species, human and otherwise. And when the decisions were made, they were based on a principle that humanity had long known, but the Highborn had never truly understood until now: that the whole was stronger than the sum of its parts. The Highborn were no longer the undisputed rulers of the galaxy. In their place, a new balance had emerged. Humanity, having proven itself capable of diplomacy, trade, science, and even the arts, had become a new pillar in the galactic structure. But it wasn't the only one. The lesser species, once considered inferior and weak, were now essential partners in the new galactic order. The Ascendancy's old hierarchical system, which had relegated the lesser species to subservience, was gone. The economy now thrived not just on the old industrial worlds of the Highborn, but across the galaxy, from mining colonies to agricultural planets to research stations where humans and non-human species worked side by side. Technological innovations had flourished thanks to human collaborative methods, but they had been bolstered by the skills of other species who brought their own specialized knowledge and creativity. The galaxy was no longer divided into strict categories of superior and inferior. It was a patchwork of unique strengths, coming together to form something greater. And in the marketplace of ideas, where humanity had once introduced music, art, and literature, new cultural movements now thrived. Human poets were now alongside highborn philosophers, teaching the galaxy to see itself in new ways. Human humor was now understood not as something shallow, but as a lens for seeing deeper truths. Art, once a commodity in the hands of a few, was now an exploration of the many. A flourishing of different cultures, all intertwined, each enriching the others. Lord Atraxas had become something of a philosopher king, having helped guide the empire through its most turbulent period. Once the proud defender of the Highborn's superiority, he had long since abandoned the notion that their species were above all others. In the years since humanity had first arrived, Atraxas had come to understand that the true power of the Ascendancy lay not in its military might or its ancient traditions, but in its ability to connect. The first real test of humanity's influence had come when Atraxas had placed himself in direct opposition to the highborn military caste, led by General Xyrath. But now, General Xyrath was gone, and in his place was a new generation of leaders, those who had learned to embrace humanity's ways. It had not been an easy transition, and there had been resistance, but the fact remained that the Highborn Empire was now a more unified and, more importantly, inclusive empire. As Atraxas stood beside Yao on the observation deck of the Imperial Palace, watching the stars shift in the distance, he knew they had achieved something far greater than just a change in leadership. They had created an empire of ideas, an empire where no species was above another, where the boundaries of cultural superiority had dissolved, and in their place, a new shared strength had emerged. "We have done it," Atraxas said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of years spent thinking, wondering, doubting. "The empire we envisioned is not the empire we have now, but perhaps this one will last." Yao turned to him, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Not just last, Lord Atraxas," she replied, "but thrive." The years ahead promised much for the galaxy. The Ascendancy, now no longer a monolith of singular power, but a federation of interwoven civilizations, was beginning to reach out further into the stars. The peaceful and diplomatic methods humanity had brought to the galaxy were not seen as a weakness. They had become a strength. The concept of diplomacy, once thought too fragile to succeed in a galaxy filled with warlords and conquerors, had become the cornerstone of the new era. Wars between the galaxy's species were no longer fought with guns and bombs, but with ideas and compromise. Where once there had been conflict and division, now there was a chance at lasting unity. Humanity, having shown that it was not a conqueror but a connector, had helped to guide the galaxy into this new age. And with their seat at the table, earned not by force but by understanding, they had helped to shape the future in a way no one had thought possible. The Highborn had learned, painfully at first, but ultimately wisely, that true power came not from domination, but from the ability to connect. The empire had been won, not by weapons, not by bloodshed, but by ideas. And in the end, humanity hadn't just earned a place at the table. They had made the galaxy want them there. As the stars stretched out before them, there was no more uncertainty. There was only the future. And that future, for the first time, looked like it belonged to everyone.